webinar today.
Thanks, Chuck. Again, I'm Chris Cable. With me I have Elizabeth Whitaker and Gretchen Gilliam from our office as well. First, I want to welcome everyone for joining us today. Welcome you all joining us today, and thank you for taking the time to be with us. We'd also like to, of course, thank ASBO and Chuck for always being so gracious to host these webinars and making it possible for all of you to attend without having to travel anywhere away from your district. The PowerPoint for this webinar is now posted on ASBO's website, and the recording of the webinar will be posted following today's session. You should have also received an email yesterday with a link to our website where we've posted the review tool that we'll be introducing in today's webinar. But if you haven't already downloaded or printed that review tool, don't worry, you'll still be able to follow along with us today as we look at each part of the tool. Today's webinar, as Chuck mentioned, is the last in a three-part series covering auxiliary operations. The first two webinars from August and October of 2012 were recorded and are available on ASBO's website and our office's website as well. If you're not already familiar with the policies and procedures that your district should have in place for auxiliary operations, you can review those webinars to become more familiar with those issues. In today's webinar, we'll address district-level oversight of auxiliary operations and introduce that auxiliary operations review tool that we designed to help district management evaluate their district operations and identify process improvements. I see from the registration list today that we have people in all types of district and school level positions attending. So no matter what your title is, if you're involved in overseeing how others at your district conduct the day-to-day operations of auxiliary operations, our webinar today will expand your resources to review those operations. Please feel free to send in your questions at any time during the webinar, and we'll either be able to address them during that part of the session or we'll get to them at the end. And if perhaps we don't get to your specific question, we will contact you shortly after the webinar. So why should we focus so much on auxiliary operations? Sometimes people think of auxiliary operations as insignificant, and they don't stop to think about the risks that are present with auxiliary operations monies and operations more than most other district operations. Those risks are there because of the decentralized operations and type of transactions that are accounted for in auxiliary operations, making it one of the areas in your district that is most susceptible to fraud, misuse, and mistakes in accounting for money. As you know, auxiliary operations are generally school bookstore and athletic activities, but they also include other district-related operations such as vending machine contracts, sometimes yearbook sales, school picture proceeds, and other types of sale transactions that aren't related to your food service program. The risk is greater with auxiliary operations not only because they are most often decentralized operations happening at your individual schools, but because the monies that are received for auxiliary operations are generally in the form of cash and often small bills. So they can be used by anyone that can get a hold of those monies. And the revenues and expenditures are most often handled in bank accounts that only a few people work with, making it easier to misuse monies if even one person isn't paying enough attention to what they're approving or signing. And we know everyone's busy, and it's easy to get caught up in moving paperwork along without doing the right review and approval. Consider the football games at your school district. How many people are at the gates that collect those monies? Some districts see a pretty significant amount of money come in through athletic events and gate ticket sales, as well as concessions. So how are those sales and the monies received being accounted for? Who's responsible for ensuring the monies are safeguarded? In some cases we've seen district or school level management didn't get involved and find out what was happening in its school level auxiliary operations until something big went wrong and monies were already missing. While at least that can serve as a wake-up call for those districts, oftentimes the call comes only after years of misuse have gone undetected. And we know none of you want to be in that situation. All of these issues lead to a greater chance that auxiliary operations monies can be misplaced or stolen, and they point out the importance of having good procedures in place to monitor and safeguard them. Because remember, auxiliary operation monies are district monies. They're public monies, just like your M&O fund monies. And none of us would ever think that M&O fund monies weren't worth the effort to protect. So we want to make sure we all remember those auxiliary operations monies are worth that effort too. In districts with more than one school, business managers and other district-level employees can feel disconnected from those school-level auxiliary operations. But as business managers or district employees charged with oversight, it's vital to know about all of your district's financial operations. The Auxiliary Operations Review Tool was specifically designed for school district business managers, but it can, of course, be used by anyone not directly involved with the day-to-day operations of auxiliary operations. It's meant to help you obtain an overview and understanding of your district's operations at each campus and for each type of activity. By examining your district's operations firsthand, you'll better understand what, if any, changes should be made to strengthen controls and protect district resources. The review tool is a Word document, which can be modified to meet your district's current needs. The tool is separated into different topics like revenue, expenditures, and bank accounts. So you can use just one part of the tool at a time, or you could review all areas together for a campus, depending on your district's specific needs and concerns. The review tool can be used anytime, not just fiscal year end. For example, if the district has a change in personnel at one school mid-year, you could use one or more parts of the review tool to look at operations at that school to ensure that appropriate policies are still being followed by the new personnel. That way, the new personnel has confirmation early on that they're doing things correctly, or they can learn the correct procedures before they spend too long building bad habits. No matter how you use the review tool, it's important that you review each campus individually and document your results. Because while the district has uniform policies in place for all campuses to follow, more than likely, the fact that one campus operates in line with those district policies doesn't mean that other campuses operate the same way. You want to set up a schedule for yourself to cycle through your district schools if you have multiple campuses with auxiliary operations. And you can always take lessons learned from one campus and apply them to training that you'll use for all campuses in the future. As we walk through the review tool, you'll notice page numbers in the upper right-hand corner of the slide on your screen. These are page numbers of the review tool areas that we're covering. So if you have the tool easily accessible, you can follow along as we go through the various areas, or simply use that page number to help you refer to the tool later. So let's start by looking at the first area in the review tool, comparisons. Auditors like to call this analytics, but auditors like to use big words. So we've taken it a little simpler here and called it comparisons, because that's truly what it is. A comparison can be used to assess change in amounts of expenditures, revenues, inventories, and other balances from one period of time to another. Small variances, as well as differences resulting from operational changes, are to be expected. But any unusual or larger than expected changes in balances or relationships between balances should be investigated and explained. Here's a look at the example form included in the review tool that you can use to compare your district's balances. As you can see, this form looks at expenses, revenues, and inventory. We've divided the form up into various areas to assess the change for various activities like bookstore and athletics. In each activity, we further separated revenues and expenditures into related items like non-payroll and payroll expenses. And for revenue, we looked at bookstore sales, fees, and donations, as well as gate receipts and concession sales. By analyzing expenses, revenues, and inventory at this level of detail, you can more easily determine where changes are occurring and assess if those changes are appropriate. Also, it's important to not only look at line items on an individual level, but to also compare changes between line items as well. And remember, these are our examples, but you should modify or add lines based on your own district's operations. So let's take a look at a couple of examples using this tool for comparisons. Gretchen will go ahead and walk us through the first one.
Thank you, Chris. Now, certain areas can be analyzed on an ongoing basis. For example, parking is an area where the majority of the money is collected at the beginning of the school year. I have often seen that schools have someone outside the bookstore, such as their school office staff, that are responsible for maintaining the parking documentation and distributing the parking permits, whereas the bookstore staff are responsible for collecting the parking payments and issuing a receipt that is then used to obtain the parking permit from the school office. Now, this control can be very helpful as it requires a receipt to be issued and shown to another employee. But even if that is the case, it is still very important for someone to review the records of sales and deposits to ensure that they are consistent with the number of receipts and parking permits issued. So in this example provided, the total parking permit sales are being compared from August and September from one year to the previous year. These 2 months were chosen for comparison because the majority of parking revenues are collected during this time frame, with a few parking permits made throughout the year if students purchase a vehicle or have a birthday that makes them legal to drive. Also in this example, this school has approximately 1,500 students enrolled on average, so it is a quite large school. And the cost of each parking permit is $10 to park in the school's parking lot for the entire school year. As you can see, in August and September of 2011, the school's office's records indicated that there were 121 parking permits issued, and the bookstore reported parking revenues of $1,210. However, as you can see, in August and September of 2012, the school's office's records indicated that there were 130 parking permits issued, but the bookstore reported only $40 in related revenue. So as the change in the parking permits issued appears reasonable at a 7% change, the negative 90% change in parking revenues reported is not reasonable, and it should be further investigated.
Thanks, Gretchen. Let's take a look at another example that looks at more than one balance and how they relate to each other. Say your high school bookstore reported sales of $156,000 in fiscal 11 and $143,500 in fiscal 12. A comparison would show that sales decreased by $12,500 or 8%, which by itself might not seem unreasonable. In addition, let's say that your non-payroll bookstore expenses increased by 10% from $100,000 to $110,000 in this same time. That too might not look unreasonable by itself. But with these two balances going in opposite directions, it would be a good idea to look a little farther before deciding everything looked okay. With a decrease in revenues and an increase in non-payroll expenditures, you might expect to see an increase in inventory on hand between the 2 years. So what if the inventory on hand had decreased 10%? Would that make sense with these changes? No. But is that a sure indicator that the inventory or money was being stolen? Not necessarily. But it is a possible sign that something is wrong. You should definitely investigate more to understand what reasonable reasons there might be for this change. So if I looked at these individual lines, I might have said, yes, these changes are reasonable. But when I look at them together and then I add in knowing about what's happening to inventory, I change my mind and I say, okay, these don't look reasonable. I need to do some more work to find out what's going on. So you can already see that comparisons can be a quick monitoring tool. But it's important to know that their usefulness is limited and other more in-depth review procedures should be used as well. One more thing to point out about comparisons is that they don't measure the accuracy of account balances. They only measure change. Therefore, if amounts were under or over-reported in the past, and they're still under or over-reported, comparison of just one type of balance is not likely to detect a problem. Just because sales remain steady doesn't mean all sales are being properly accounted for and revenues are being deposited. With that in mind, I'm going to turn things over to Elizabeth to continue going over the review tool, starting with reviewing revenues.
Thanks, Chris. As Chris previously mentioned, auxiliary operations revenues can come from a variety of sources, including athletic gate receipts, student picture sales, bookstore sales, and field trip fees. In addition, these revenues can be collected and documented using different methods, including tickets, receipts without a cash register, and receipts with a cash register. Whatever method is used, the district should ensure that all monies received are accounted for and deposited intact. To help ensure proper controls are in place for all cash collections, transactions should be sampled from each type of activity and each type of collection process at a campus, especially if different employees are involved in the cash collections. And remember, looking at one campus's operations is just that, one campus's operations. So be sure to look at all campuses at some point in your review process. On this slide, we have part of the revenue section from page 3 of the review tool illustrated. As you can see here, we ask you to fill in the types of auxiliary operations activities and the different methods used to document sales for each at your district. This helps ensure that you have an understanding of how the different auxiliary operations activities are being accounted for. To test ticket or non-cash register receipt sales, begin by selecting events from the district's calendar of scheduled events. Then pull the related daily sales report for the selected event. Document the sales report number, report date, name of ticket seller or receipt issuer, the next ticket or receipt number to be issued, the beginning ticket or receipt number issued, and the total number of tickets sold, ticket prices, and total sales. If you look at page 4 in the review tool, you can see that we suggest pulling a sample of at least 5 items. In the example illustrated on this slide, we are simply showing a partial sample for illustrative purposes. In this partial sample, we just pulled 2 different activities from the district's calendar of scheduled events. First, we selected the dance ticket sales from February 12th, which were recorded on daily sales report number 5, and we also selected yearbook sales from February 20th, which were reported using the daily sales report number 12. You know you've identified your first area for improvement if you select an activity to review and you find no daily sales report was prepared. But let's assume you were able to pull reports for each item you selected. Then, using those reports, the first step is to determine if the total sales amount on the daily sales report agrees to the number of tickets sold and the ticket price, or the total of all receipts issued. In our dance ticket example, we see that 153 tickets were sold at $3 each for total sales of $459, which agrees to the amount listed on the daily sales report. In our second example, for yearbook sales, we did not issue tickets. In this case, we must add up all the sales receipts issued to ensure that $2,200 was actually collected and properly recorded. Next, check to see that the daily sales report was reviewed and signed by a supervisor. Check the sales report to determine if there were any cash overages or shortages noted, and if so, that they were appropriately investigated and resolved. For ticket sales, you also want to check to see that the next ticket number on the previous ticket sales report is the same as the beginning ticket number on each of your selected daily sales reports, and that the beginning ticket number on the next daily sales report is the same as the next ticket number on each of your selected sales reports. In our dance ticket example, we know that the previous event that tickets were issued for was a varsity football game a week before the dance. Taking a look at the daily sales report for the varsity football game, it states that the next ticket number to be issued was 3,500. Since the beginning ticket number issued on the dance sales report was 3,876, we can see here that we have 376 tickets that are unaccounted for and must be investigated. For sales where receipts were issued, check to see if the receipts were issued sequentially with no gaps in receipt numbers between consecutive sales reports, and if duplicate copies of the receipts were retained. In our example illustrated here, the receipt numbers issued for yearbook sales are numbers 1210 through 1320.
Now, it is very important to ensure that there are no gaps in sequence in the ticket or receipt numbers issued. All receipt numbers should be accounted for regardless if they are voided or not, and ticket numbers should always be verified against the last ticket number issued. So if any of this documentation does not agree or it does not appear correct, it should definitely be investigated, and any issues should be documented and resolved appropriately.
Let's move on to cash register sales. To test cash register sales, begin by selecting various events and/or dates from the district's calendar of scheduled events or business days. If you are testing concession sales that were collected with a cash register, select the days to test by using a school calendar that contains a schedule of athletic events and concession sales. Again, if there is not a daily sales report for the school day selected, ensure that the activity wasn't canceled on that specific day, and if concession sales really occur, find out where the monies were deposited and how they were recorded, in addition to strengthening procedures to help ensure that all sales are documented. Using the related daily sales report for the days or events selected, document the report number, report date, cashier, and total sales amount. Then, using your sample, make sure that there is a Z audit tape, that is the total end of day cash register audit tape, attached to the daily sales report, and record the total sales amount. Check to see if the Z tape number is one more than the Z tape number on the previous day's sales report, and one less than the Z tape number on the next day's sales report. Also ensure that amounts on the daily sales report are mathematically accurate. Check to see if the total sales amount on the daily sales report agrees to the registered total tape. Also ensure that if there were any overrings or canceled sales shown on the audit tape, that they were adequately documented and explained. In our example for concession sales, illustrated here, we can see that the daily sales report indicated sales of $250. Taking a look at the registered total tape amount, however, the total sales amount is for $298, a difference of $48. This is a red flag, and the missing sales monies should be investigated. If any of the documentation does not agree and does not appear to be correct, it should also be investigated, and any issues should be documented and resolved appropriately.
I'd like to intercede here quickly, Elizabeth, if I may. Now, Elizabeth spoke briefly about the Z-tape numbers and that they should be in sequential order with each Z-tape generated. So in the example illustrated on this slide, we can see that the daily sales report number 65 has a corresponding Z-tape number of Z0660. As such, we must ensure that the Z-tape issued prior to Z0660 is one less and that there are no gaps. As the district issues a new Z-tape every day, we will take a look at the previous day's Z-tape number. Upon our investigation, we find that on March 26th of 2013, Z-tape number Z0658 was issued, not Z0659. So this indicates that there is a gap in the issuance in sequence and that Z0659 is unaccounted for. Now, although the sample form in the USFR doesn't currently include a section to document the Z-tape report number, I've audited schools where I've seen that they've added a specific place to their form where the prior report and the current report Z-tape numbers are required to be filled in. Requiring your employees to include this information on the form can be a deterrent in that the person responsible for for preparing the documents is also signing the document stating that there are no gaps in sequence of the Z-tape numbers. So in addition, the supervisor and district personnel that review this information will also be reminded to review it to ensure this information is in fact correct, just like all the other information on the report. There really isn't a good reason or justification for having gaps in sequence of these registered total tapes, since any appropriate adjustments can be made to the cash register tapes without having to total out the register and re-ring the day's activity. So in addition to looking for gaps in Z-tape numbers, adjustments are another area that should be closely reviewed on each cash register tape, as they represent changes in the total sales that could be reasonable, but they could also be related to fraud. So any adjustments process should include adequate documentation for the reasoning for the adjustment, such as inputting the wrong account category of revenues received, or possibly a canceled sale when a student didn't have enough money to complete the purchase. A log can also be maintained listing out all the adjustments, a description of why the adjustment was made, and who made the adjustment. So again, remember all ticket numbers, receipt numbers, and cash register Z-tape numbers should be compared between reports to ensure that there are no gaps in sequence and that everything has been accounted for. If there are gaps, something is missing, so it should be investigated and resolved.
Thanks, Gretchen. Now that we have covered how to test actual sales, let's move on and examine deposit procedures. Once sales are complete, it is important that monies are deposited timely and intact. You can test deposits separately from revenue or together with the same sample. For our example here, we will assume that you are looking only at deposits, so we will pull a sample just for deposits, randomly selecting various school days and their corresponding daily cash collection summaries. If cash collections do not occur daily, you can use a schedule of related activities, such as the schedule of home games for athletic ticket and concession sales, or the schedule of bookstore days and hours if the bookstore is not open every single school day. Remember to document any missing cash collection reports and investigate where the monies went, as well as tighten up those procedures. In our example, we randomly chose to test sales and deposits for February 18th, 2013. Sales for this date were recorded on the Daily Cash Collection Summary Report, number 574. First, we must review the validated deposit documentation and accounting records to make sure that all cash collected was deposited in the appropriate bank account within 7 days of receipt. Upon reviewing the validated deposit receipt in our example, we see that $828.25 was deposited on March 4th, 2013. While the validated deposit receipt amount agrees to the Daily Cash Collection Summary Report, the cash was deposited 2 weeks after the money had been received. This is definitely an issue that the district must address. Next, we must determine if the total cash amount on the summary report is equal to the sum of the cash collected on the sales reports for that day. The summary report might only be comprised of one sales report or could be comprised of several. In our sample here, summary report number 574 is comprised of 2 sales reports. Report number 1094 for JV football concession sales and report number 1096 for tax credits. Now, taking a look at these 2 things here, do you notice anything weird? Perhaps you're wondering where sales report number 1095 is. Before we proceed, we must investigate what happened to sales report number 1095. Upon further investigation, we find that the sales report 1095 was for snow cone sales on February 18th. The report shows that $150 was collected. Since that report was left out of the Daily Cash Collection Summary Report for that day, the money was overlooked and never deposited. To prevent such happenings, we must re-examine our procedures and see what we need to do to prevent this from happening again. Now that we have covered sales revenues and deposit procedures, let's turn our attention to auxiliary operations expenditures. Remember, auxiliary operations purchases should be approved by the governing board, just like any other district expenditure. In addition, purchases should follow appropriate procurement procedures and be supported by documentation, including invoices and receiving reports. Purchases should be reviewed to help prevent misuse, theft, or loss of district monies. To test controls over auxiliary operations expenditures, begin by randomly selecting payments from the district's auxiliary operations bank account check register and record the corresponding check number, date, amount, and payee description. Then, for each payment, determine whether the purchase was supported by a properly approved purchase order and a vendor invoice or receipt. Check to see if the purchase order was approved by the appropriate supervisor before the goods or services were ordered. If you are able to view the check image on the bank's website, check to see that the check number, payee, and amount in the check register agree to the processed check and that the check has 2 authorized signatures. If you are unable to view the check images, ensure that the information in the district's bank statement agrees to the information in the check register. Finally, ensure that the payee, like Staples, is a district-approved vendor, and that all appropriate procurement procedures were followed based on the dollar amount spent on like items by the district, not just auxiliary operations expenditures, and not just for that vendor.
Now, when reviewing auxiliary operation expenditures, it is very important to pay special attention to payments made to people rather than businesses. So make sure that there is supporting documentation for all payments made. And while payments from employees or individuals are not always a red flag, payments should never be made to check signers or to their family members from the account. So in this example is illustrated here, we must ensure that the payment to Jane Smith is appropriate. Now, if Jane Smith is the account custodian, then no payments should be made to her from this account. Any appropriate payments made to Jane, such as travel reimbursements, should be authorized by other district personnel and processed through other means. So in this case, we reviewed documentation to see that the payment was for supplies purchased for snow cone sales, and the receipt was attached to the authorization. So this check to reimburse Jane was fine, as long as she is not the account custodian. If any of the documentation does not agree or does not appear to be correct, it should be investigated and any issue should be documented and resolved appropriately.
Now that we have covered sampling for both revenue and expenditure transactions, let's review separation of responsibilities. When it comes to safeguarding district monies, separation of responsibilities is key. Sometimes districts will think that they have appropriate separation in place, but it never hurts to check. It is vital that proper procedures are actually placed into operation and periodically tested so that they don't just exist in theory alone. And it's not enough to simply verify initials on documents to confirm that reviews are happening. We have come across situations in which the person responsible for verifying cash simply signs off on the cash collections report without first counting and reconciling the collections. This is an instance in which even the documentation makes it appear that appropriate controls exist, but in reality they don't. To reduce the risk that district monies will be lost, misused, or stolen, duties related to cash handling, record keeping, and authorization should be separated among employees. If a person has responsibilities in more than one of these areas, there is a higher risk for both the improper use of monies as well as honest mistakes in processing going unnoticed and unfixed. Sometimes management will assign duties to one employee, but in reality another employee might actually be performing the duty. Through observation and review of documentation, you can verify which duties each employee is performing. If your district is smaller and unable to divide these 3 types of duties among different employees, there should be compensating controls in place. The review tool includes tables to document responsibilities relating to revenue and expenditure processing. Each table is color-coded to designate proper separation. Those responsibilities that are compatible with each other are given the same color. Responsibilities that are given different colors are incompatible. For example, the revenue responsibilities are divided up into 3 colors: yellow, blue, and pink. An employee who performs a responsibility shaded in yellow should only perform other responsibilities also colored yellow. That employee should not have responsibilities colored blue or pink. To review revenue and expenditure processing for appropriate separation of responsibilities, first, fill in the assigned employee column based on district documentation of assigned responsibilities. Then go ahead and observe operations and fill in the actual employee column based upon that observation. Let's take a look at an example here. Looking at the revenue responsibilities, assigned employees and actual employees illustrated in this example, we can see that Sam has a lot of responsibilities. And those duties have been assigned to him, and upon both observation and test work, we were able to verify that he was actually performing these duties as well. Taking a look at the duties highlighted in blue, we see that the duties of collecting cash, issuing receipts or tickets, counting cash, and preparing the cash collected portion of the daily sales report have all been assigned to Debbie, which appears appropriate. After observing the processes and completing test work, however, we find that Sam is actually the one counting cash and preparing all parts of the daily sales report. Debbie is not involved like we had thought. So, in this case, Sam has incompatible duties. Debbie, or someone else who is independent of the process, should be counting cash before Sam does and documenting the cash count. If no one other than Sam is able to count the cash right away and document the collection on the daily sales report, someone other than Sam should review the total sales, recount the cash, and complete the sales report. Moving on to those duties highlighted in pink, we see here that Joe has been assigned to compare the sales reports and cash collection summaries to validated deposit documentation. And Sam has been assigned to recording the deposits in the accounting records. After observation and test work, we also determined that Sam and Joe are completing their assigned duties. Although that would normally be a good thing, in this case it is not. Sam's duty here with recording deposits in the accounting records is incompatible with his other duties, those highlighted in yellow. In this case, it would be ideal for Joe to record the revenue in the accounting records, as he is already assigned the other duties highlighted in pink. So, as you can see by this example, simply reviewing the revenue and expenditure responsibilities for appropriate separation of incompatible duties, you might encounter other areas that might need to be looked into further. Before we look at the review tools for reviewing auxiliary operations bank accounts, let's recall that all auxiliary operations bank accounts must be authorized by the governing board. In addition, each bank account can only be used for its intended purpose as dictated by statute. The district is allowed one auxiliary operations fund bank account, and each campus is allowed one auxiliary operations fund revolving bank account. To ensure that your district's accounts are in compliance, begin by reviewing all blank check stock on hand at each campus and determining if it is adequately secured and if there are any unauthorized accounts being maintained. It is vital that the district does not have any unauthorized bank accounts and that management is aware of all the bank accounts that are open. If adequate controls are not established, monies can be deposited incorrectly, spent inappropriately, or maybe even stolen. The district should perform monthly reconciliations on each bank account to verify the accuracy of both the bank and the district's balances. In order to test monthly bank reconciliations, randomly select 3-month bank reconciliations to review and determine if the reconciliation was prepared by one employee and reviewed by another employee, and if the reviewer was independent of check processing duties. Examine the reconciliation to ensure that it was prepared and reviewed within a reasonable amount of time after the statement was received. Make sure that the reconciliation shows evidence that all deposits and disbursements were compared to supporting documentation, and that if there were any bank transfers, that they were investigated and determined to be appropriate. You should also confirm that the bank statement shows that there were no cash withdrawals made, ATM or otherwise. The last area of the review tool centers around inventory. Districts should maintain a complete and accurate inventory list to account for all items held for sale. Inventory in each area should be separately tracked to ensure accurate financial reporting. In addition, proper inventory review procedures can help ensure the district's inventory is adequately safeguarded and help prevent theft, overstocking, understocking, spoilage, and obsolescence. Inventory review procedures should be completed regularly to ensure inventories are accurate and changes are consistent with reported sales. Inventory should be examined not only in the bookstore, but also inventory used in athletic event concessions and any other areas of auxiliary operations that your district may have. Districts using a perpetual inventory system should conduct an inventory at least every 3 years, and districts using a periodic inventory system should conduct inventory at least once a year. A district's inventory list should include item and unit description, purchase document number, quantity on hand, unit cost, extended cost, page totals, and a grand total as well. The yes or no questions that are shown on this slide can then be used to review the inventory basics before samples. The following test of inventory accuracy can be done at any time for perpetual inventory systems and immediately following an inventory and periodic inventory systems to validate your inventory results. When testing inventory, it is important to ensure that the inventory on hand, both the description and the quantity, agree to the inventory list, and also that your inventory list agrees to the inventory you have on hand and the purchase documentation, kind of like a two-way street. The first table shown here is for sampling from the items on hand and then checking to see that they are recorded accurately in the inventory. The second table shown here is for sampling from the items in the inventory list and then checking to see that they are actually on hand. The review tool includes lines for a total of 10 items to be tested for each area, but you may want to check more items if you find problems with your initial sample. Let's take a look at the questions that have come in so far. Chris, do we have any questions?
We do have a couple, and if anyone else wants to send some in, we'll get to those as well. So one of the questions related to deposits was, does having an armored car pick up the cash equal a deposit date, or is the day that the money actually makes it to the bank the deposit date? So not having experience with what you might receive from the armored car when they pick up, I'm guessing there's documentation. So you're going to receive some type of receipt for what they've taken from you with probably a date and time stamp on it. That could go along with the validated deposit slip so that technically depositing to the bank is the date it's deposited to the bank. But as an auditor, if I were looking at your transactions and saw that at 6 days past the receipt of those monies, you turned them over to the armored car service, and at 8 days the bank processed that deposit, I don't ever think there'd probably be that kind of lag. But if there was, then at the 8th day when they processed that, you'd have the date of both documents to show that you did secure those monies for deposit with the bank within the week from when they were received. I hope that takes care of that question. We had another question about timeliness of deposit, which was what happens if there's a school break? Money comes in on the Friday before the 2-week break for winter. And while auditors are gifted at picking transactions where you've had a problem, there are always extenuating circumstances to look at. So if I had selected a sample of 5 different receipts and looked for their timeliness of deposit and noted that the only one that had a timeliness issue was the one that happened on the Friday before the winter break, and that I could indeed tell that all those monies were deposited, no monies went missing, all documentation showed that the amount that was received then was deposited, albeit 2.5 weeks later, I wouldn't consider that to be a significant deficiency for the district. That doesn't mean you can't look into good ways to try to get those monies deposited on the last day before a long break, because unfortunately we hear too often about schools that get broken into over breaks, and the people who aren't sending their kids to school and the neighborhoods who aren't seeing the traffic, everybody knows people aren't around. And that's a good time for break-ins to occur, unfortunately. I know that a lot of schools get some vandalism or damage over breaks like that. So if you have those monies sitting there, they're running a risk. So why not put a policy in place to get them deposited on the afternoon of that last day before the 2-week break? So that is everything we have that's of a more general nature as far as questions. If you have some and want to send them in, we'll be happy to cover those. I'm going to allow a little time for that while I sort of wrap up the information we have here. So we hope that you found the review tool that we covered today good information, and it'll be useful to you in evaluating your district's auxiliary operations process. Remember, the tool doesn't have to be used all at once. It can be used throughout the year to examine the different areas of auxiliary operations. And I know that the processes that you see on those review tools may look really detailed and in-depth as far as what you're looking at and analyzing. But remember, you're only looking at a sample. We're not asking you to look at every transaction that's occurred in your auxiliary operations. But if you take a sample and look at those in much more detail, you'll find that you can identify problems that may be much more widely spread in your situation. Or you might, hopefully, you're going to find that things are looking good and you don't have areas to correct. That review tool can also help you ensure that your district's resources are adequately utilized and operating efficiently when you take a look at what your operations are. Just a little bit of a review can go a long way in achieving those goals. So as district or school level supervisors, you know that what the process should be, of course, for your auxiliary operations, but by asking the questions that are involved in the review tool, you can determine what others think that process is too. And you also probably know what training employees have received on appropriate procedures, but confirming that that training is being put to good use through observation and sampling lets you really know that the appropriate procedures are being used. So once again, you can download the review tool from our website at the link shown on the slide. And as always, we encourage you to contact our office if you have any questions while going through these steps at your district. We can be reached at the contact information on your slide. We did have a couple more questions come in. So one of them we anticipated receiving was, might we have a review tool for student activities at some point in the future? And the answer to that is yes. We definitely will be looking at a redesign or tweaks to this auxiliary operations review tool for it to work for student activities. But I'll tell you right now that if you're encountering some issues and wondering if you have some problems with student activities, this review tool could fairly easily be modified for your own process on student activities, even before waiting for us to get a chance to issue out a formal review tool for student activities. Things you'd want to add in, obviously you could listen in to the student activities webinar that we did and listen to the issues related to separation of responsibilities there to make sure that you're watching for the right responsibilities to be separate. And you can also look at the requirements for review and approval by student clubs, documenting club minutes, things like that, so that you can be sure to apply those appropriate tests to what you're looking at under student activities. Let's see. Sorry, scanning through questions that just now came in. We did have a couple people ask if the review tool is on our site, but of course it is there. We'll also be posting the recorded webinar and the slides from today along with an outline after we get those documents available, and we'll put them up on our site for future use. So that's basically it. If you have any further questions, we're happy to take those, like I said, through telephone or email with the contact information on the slide. Again, we'd like to thank you for attending today's webinar and submitting your questions. Also, we'd like to thank ASBO again for hosting this webinar and for all that they do to help school districts stay informed.
Thank you. We want to thank Chris, Elizabeth, and Gretchen for providing all the information today and to give you some very important things to be thinking about and to implement in your district. I just want to, before you leave, remind you of the two upcoming ASBO meetings that we've talked about earlier. We started the webinar today. The first one is April 17th, Wednesday, April 17th in Tucson at Santa Rita High School. That'll be the Southern Arizona ASBO meeting that we have each spring. It's open to everyone.